One of the biggest things in our pop culture is comic books. They're they've just been around for years and years and years, and they are so ingrained in our pop culture that it's kind of hard to dismiss them in everyday life that we have. So I want to do my pop culture topic on comic books. A little history of comic books. Um, 1938 to 1950 was the golden age of comics. This is when it was the birth of some of the comics that we still hold near and dear to our hearts. Superheroes were born, like Superman, Batman, and the reason they were made was to help through the Depression and World War II. Right after, there was the decline of the comics in 1950 to 1956. Comics moved towards horror comics, and they started getting a lot darker, and there were links shown between juveniles and the horror comics. So the Comic Codes Authority wrote a comic regulation to stop them from making them so dark. And once that happened, they started being more prevalent. So we were able to trash that little era that was, and then became the Silver Age of comics. This was between 1956 and 1970. Um, the change started with the modern version of The Flash. There was only three comic heroes at the time that had their own titles, which was Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. But when The Flash was modernized and released, people took to it well, and they started to become prevalent again. Um, Batman first premiered on TV, and they invaded homes during this time, so it was just more than books. People could actually watch their heroes in life. And DC started taking off, but with more popularity, they became a lot more stiffer competition. Marvel was around since 1939, and their hit hero at that time was Captain America. Uh, they weren't really into the game until the 1960s. Stan Lee saw the potential in modern comics and capitalized by making new heroes and putting them into world situations. So in the 60s, he started to see this and he started to bring back his brand. They started with the Fantastic Four, which was a huge hit, but in 1962 he hit his gold, which it was his best-selling hero, The Amazing Spider-Man, which turned into an absolute gold mine for him. From the 1970s to 1985, popularity grew with it. We saw the rise of many heroes and groups such as X-Men. During this time, superheroes were put into political situations and more used for world, and so people could actually relate to them in everyday life. And during this time in the 1970s, a little guy named Lou Ferrigno starred in The Hulk, and this was a huge Hulk smash hit. Um, During this era, it was known as the Bronze Age, and it was still picking up steam, and everybody was still into comics. Um, Modern Age, which is 1985 to current, people started collecting and preserving originals at this point because they started seeing value in it. Because it has been around for 30 years at this point. But in the 80s, the characters became a little more darker anti heroes, like Wolverine and Daredevil. They started having edginess to them. Um, in the 90s, the X-Men had become the most popular comic in the era. It was on TV. I remember just as a kid watching it constantly on TV. Um, that and Spider-Man all the time. But X-Men was the go-to comic. Um, they really started taking to the movie screen. They had a couple before the 80s, but they didn't go off until you had Tim Burton's Batman in 1989, which featured the Joker, Jack Nicholson, and Michael Keaton. And during this time, there was a plethora of printed materials in the 90s. Um, Comic book collectors don't look for 90s comics because there are so many that were printed during this time that they're a dime a dozen. So it's the older comics that are really valuable now. If you have 90s, they're probably worth $1 or so, but they weren't nearly worth what they are back from the 60s and before. Um, Today, it's normal for sellout crowds, midnight showings to movies. It's one of the most like fantastic nights of your life. You've just been waiting for stuff to come out. The competition for superior brands are high between DC and Marvel. Um, Multi-million dollar movies are just being produced and released yearly, multiple at a clip. It's just so ingrained as part of our culture that there's not a day you can go by without seeing an emblem or somebody even talking about it, someone's t-shirt, everywhere. Uh, Kids look up to these superheroes. They dress up like them. Halloween, Iron Man is one of the most popular outfits. Um, the movies have made comics very, very ingrained in our society. Just companies are putting out memorabilia daily trying to get people's money because we're just buying and buying and buying. And while the comic books are still around, they have moved to more of digital copies. They now you can get them instantly instead of going and waiting for them to come out to stores. You can get subscriptions. They're not as popular getting them anymore. The movies have become more popular than comics themselves, but it's just an everyday occurrence that you see superhero items. It's something that somebody talks about all the time. They're conversation starters. People love them. They debate who's better. If it's on TV everywhere. If you look at like The Big Bang Theory, they're always debating about it. It's one of the biggest things in our society. So my question is, which side do you guys choose? Uh, I love both, but if I had to pick, I am a Marvel guy through and through. Um, but the comics are just so out there in our society that you cannot go a day without seeing it. Thank you guys for listening.